Welcome, everyone. For today's lesson, we're going to be focusing on one of the most important topics when we discuss the history of the classical and the early Romantic period, and that is the symphonies of Beethoven. Now, this is obviously a huge topic, could be the subject of an entire separate class, but we're just going to focus on some of the highlights of Beethoven's remarkable symphonic output, arguably the most significant group of symphonies ever written, and hugely influential on the next generation of composers. Beethoven wrote his first symphony in 1800, a few years after he had studied privately with Joseph Haydn. And so the influence of Haydn and Mozart is very strong on Beethoven's symphonies, as you would expect, but in typical Beethoven fashion, he always put his own unique take on any kind of genre that he wrote, whether it be a string quartet or a piano sonata or a symphony. And so all of these symphonies show both a respect for tradition and an attempt to move the genre of the symphony forward in some ways. So we have 9 major symphonies written between 1800 and his final 9th symphony in 1824. All of those symphonies are significant and worthy of study, and I would encourage you to take the time to listen to all the Beethoven symphonies. But 4 of them are especially significant for a variety of different reasons. And we're today going to be focusing mostly on the 3rd symphony, the famous Eroica Symphony. But I did want to make a few brief comments about some of the other really important symphonies. To most listeners, whether they be musicians or not, arguably the most famous of all of Beethoven's symphonies and one of the most famous symphonies by any composer would be the Fifth Symphony of 1808. This was written during a time when Beethoven was continuing to struggle with his deafness and with feeling more and more isolated from the world. And so the symphony is very dramatic. It's very stormy and intense in the key of C minor. As a matter of fact, his first minor key symphonic work. A number of innovations are evident in the Fifth Symphony, including introducing an expanded brass section. This is the symphony that introduced the trombones into the symphony orchestra. And also the double bass. The double bass was for the first time in this work given an independent line from the cellos, and Beethoven really exploits that extensively in the scherzo movement. Another thing that was really innovative about this symphony that would have a huge impact on the symphonies of the 19th century by composers like Schumann and Berlioz and Liszt is what is known as cyclicism. So a work that is cyclical doesn't just have to apply to symphonic music. It can also apply to piano music or songs. But a work that is cyclical means that you have some motive or theme that is going to reappear in multiple movements of a multi-movement work. And it would be used as a way to tie the piece together. So rather than just having distinct independent movements with no connections between each other, by using cyclicism, the composer is able to draw connections between the various movements. And to illustrate what I mean by that, we're going to listen to just a few short excerpts from Symphony Number 5. First of all, the famous opening, the 3 short notes and a longer note, the da-da-da-da motive. So here's just a bit of that opening. All right. So as you listen to the rest of the movement, you'll hear how frequently Beethoven makes use of that motive in all parts of the orchestra in several different keys as a way to tie the first movement together. But what is unique about cyclicism is how he brings this motive back in later movements to remind us of those connections. And so here is the opening of the scherzo. And after a short introduction for the cellos and double basses, you will hear in the horns another version of that opening motive very clearly. So that's a good example of what we call cyclicism. Symphony number 6, written in the same year as the Fifth Symphony, is known as the Pastoral Symphony. Key of F major, very common pastoral key, meaning a work that is intended to evoke the out of doors, nature, the beauty of nature, etc. So this piece was very significant for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's in 5 movements rather than the traditional 4 movements that we would normally expect. Each movement has a special title associated with them. In addition to, sounds of peasants and so forth, there's even a storm scene that takes place in this symphony. This is an early example of what would later be called program music, a topic we're going to explore in much more detail later on when we get to Berlioz and beyond. But program music simply means a piece of instrumental music that is inspired by something beyond just the music itself. So it can be an example of a poem can inspire it, a painting, a famous play. Shakespeare's plays were often used for program music, or in the case of the Pastoral Symphony, just the general idea of peace and beauty and nature. And especially since Beethoven himself, when he was writing, including in the orchestra, bird calls and things such as that he was no longer able to hear, was actually starting to use the music as a way to express many of those feelings and emotions that he was having. And then, of course, there is the Ninth Symphony, known as the Choral Symphony, so Beethoven's final symphony. This work is revolutionary in terms of length and scope, but more than anything else, it is the first symphony to make use of voices in addition to the instruments, both a full chorus and soprano, alto, tenor, bass solo parts. This work, especially the last movement, which is based on the famous Ode to Joy theme, inspired by a poem by a German poet named Friedrich Schiller, is really a revolutionary work in many, many different ways. And but above all, it's the use of the voices that makes it so revolutionary. Now let's go back a little bit earlier in Beethoven's career to the Third Symphony, or the Eroica Symphony, written primarily in 1803 to 1804. This work is a true milestone in the history of the symphony, and that's saying something when we talk about Beethoven. From the outset, though, just looking at the general structure of it, it looks fairly traditional. It's 4 movements. It has slow movement in the second position. Third movement is the dance movement, and then a fast finale. But what makes this piece so unique is what is expressed, or perhaps not expressed, in the music. Beethoven was always a composer who was very politically aware and politically savvy, and he was always supportive of figures in politics who represented liberalism or represented the idea of the voice of the people and so forth. He was not a particularly big fan of the aristocracy, and we see this in his letters and also in his dealing with aristocrats. He was often very dismissive of aristocratic titles and so forth. But one figure that he greatly admired was Napoleon Bonaparte. So early in his career, Napoleon was a consul of France, but then as his power and influence increased, he eventually decided to arrange for himself to be crowned emperor of France. Beethoven was horrified by this, by which time he had already begun to compose a symphony that was probably originally intended to be called the Bonaparte Symphony. But Beethoven, there are a couple of different accounts of what happened, but supposedly Beethoven ripped up the original title page, and then he was working on another version of the score where he had actually written in Eroica, and he scratched that out with such force that it left a hole in the paper. As a matter of fact, that manuscript is still in existence, and you can view it if you do a Google search. So it went from, being referred to as the Bonaparte Symphony into simply symphony composed in memory of a great man. Now, whether he was referring to Napoleon, in calling it a symphony in memory of a great man or not, is again subject to debate, but much more likely is that he wrote a piece in honor of the spirit of the idea of revolution, of universal brotherhood, themes he's going to explore extensively in the Ninth Symphony and the Ode to Joy section. And so rather than thinking of this as a piece just for one person, I think it's more correct to describe it as a piece about the idea of heroism itself. The piece is a monument in the history of the symphony. There had never been a symphony as lengthy and complex as this one. There had never been a symphony where the first movement alone is about the length of most classical period symphonies, all four movements, especially if you take the repeat of the exposition. Beethoven did a lot of experimentation with keys, going to very distant, very unexpected harmonic centers within this piece. The overall structure of the work, even though we're going to focus on the first movement, I just want to say a little bit about the overall structure. So I'll talk about the first movement in just a minute. The second movement is, we would normally expect a slow movement, of course, in the second position. But what is unusual about this is, first of all, that he calls it a funeral march, marcia funebre. He was drawing on the tradition of marches in the French Revolution that featured muffled drums and, characters of the revolution being celebrated as they're being, led to the cemetery or whatever. And so Beethoven actually evokes many of those sounds, even the idea of muffled drums in the use of the lower strings in this piece. It's also in a minor key, as you would expect in a funeral march, but a slow movement in the classical period, very, very rarely do you find those in minor keys. So Beethoven was doing something very different in that movement. The third movement, rather than the traditional lighthearted minuet and trio that we would expect from, say, Haydn, instead, Beethoven replaces it with a very fast style piece in 3/4 known as a scherzo, which comes from the Italian word for joke. So this is a very entirely too fast to be able to dance to. So once again, showing Beethoven kind of nodding to the tradition of the third movement being dance-like, but kind of turning it upside down. And then the finale, perhaps he was inspired, at least some by Haydn, is a gigantic theme in variations, which is based on a previous piece that Beethoven had written called The Creatures of Prometheus. The opening movement, sonata form, and as I have listed here, with a huge development and a huge coda. Beethoven completely transformed the whole structure of the opening movement to make it into this monumental, heroic musical statement. And so whereas in, say, typical symphonies of Mozart where the development section would be 50 measures or maybe a little bit more, Beethoven's is well over 100. The entire opening movement of the Eroica is nearly 700 measures long, which is absolutely unprecedented. And like he's going to do in the Fifth Symphony, Beethoven derives a lot of the material that he's going to use in this symphony, especially in the first movement, from the opening motive. So after two fortissimo chords to kind of introduce us in the style of the earlier Sinfonia, he presents the first theme, which is just really an arpeggiation of the E-flat major triad with a little twist. After that arpeggiation, he slinks down to a C sharp, which is a note completely outside of the realm of the tonic in this case. And so Beethoven is going to do that a lot. He's going to take us into unexpected harmonic territory that we were not expecting. And so to give us a little bit of a sense of that, I wanted to play just the opening of the Eroica. So listen for that da-dee-da-da-da-da-da, that arpeggiation, but listen to him go down to the C sharp. Okay. The overall movement, in terms of the broader form, is fairly standard. Exposition, repeat of the exposition, development, of course, recap and coda. But what happens in the development is a good example of some of the innovative things that Beethoven does. I want to play just a short example of that. Beethoven was really using, especially in the development section, a level of dissonance that had really not been heard in the symphony before. And so there is a couple of chords in this section that were more dissonant than any composer before had ever attempted. So here's just a bit of what I'm talking about. Especially these chords coming up. Then he introduces a new theme in the oboe. That theme is in the key of E minor. So the Neapolitan minor, to use the theoretical term, no composer had ever used, at least in a symphonic movement, a relationship quite that distant. Haydn had attempted something similar in one of his late piano sonatas, but in the symphony it was basically unheard of before Beethoven. And then the last thing that I want to mention about this opening movement is what Beethoven does in the lead up to the recapitulation. So typically there would be the section at the end of the development known as the retransition with a dominant pedal or something that's going to lead us right back into the recap. Beethoven dispenses with a lot of that. Instead, you have a lot of string tremolos, and then you're going to hear in this section third horn come in with what sounds like the first theme returning for the recap. It sounds like the horn came in too early. But when we go back and we look at Beethoven's sketches, he left a lot of sketch material for this symphony and many other pieces. We go back and look at his sketches, we see that he actually intended this from the very beginning. So I wanted to play just a little bit of that false recap. Here's the recap. All right, so it's a very clever, very creative way for him to do something new with a very long time established form. The coda of the piece, which is also quite lengthy, begins in very unusual key. The key of flat 7 actually begins in D flat major. And so Beethoven, really from beginning to end, is doing all kinds of structural things that were really unexpected. A lot of audiences at the first performance of the Eroica didn't really know what to make of it. They were sort of split into two camps. Beethoven's friends and admirers thought that he was doing really amazing, creative, thoughtful things with the symphony, but his detractors felt that the symphony was too dissonant, too difficult, and went into places harmonically and musically that they did not really understand. And I think that's one of the signs of great genius composers like Beethoven is their ability to push the envelope and move us in directions that we really did not expect. We'll talk about that vis-a-vis Beethoven's string quartets in our next film. And so thanks for your attention, and we'll be talking to you again soon.